What's up, everybody, and welcome to Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence Magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Caden Mock. On this show, we're building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength of the broad front that we need to win. On this week on the show, I'm joined by writer, lawyer, and co-founder of Interrupting Criminalization, Andrea Ritchie. She's published this free guide titled Block and Build, but Make It Abolitionist, which explores strategic frameworks for fighting right-wing authoritarianism from an abolitionist perspective, an invitation to expand our collective resistance beyond strategies that rely on the carceral state. But first, these headlines. I'm sure that our listeners by now are fully aware of the horrific flash floods that hit Kerr County, Texas last weekend, which, as of this recording, has resulted in 120 confirmed deaths and over 160 people are still missing. As expected, federal and state administration response has ranged from abysmal to the downright offensive. From Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, who said, quote, "In a moment like this, we feel just as helpless as everyone else does. All we know to do at this moment is pray, as if the government is not responsible for disaster preparedness and relief." Texas Governor Greg Abbott, meanwhile, likened the disaster to a football game, claiming that, quote, "Every team makes mistakes." Meanwhile, the people that are doing the work to understand and communicate about weather disasters have some thoughts. Tom Fahey, who's the legislative director for the National Weather Service Employees Organization, offered the following. The real blame is the Trump administration's budget cuts to the National Weather Service and FEMA that cut off coordination planning with local emergency management officials. Nearby, San Antonio and Austin weather services both report being understaffed. Kerr County itself had been warned about the potential of a flood of this magnitude, which was, quote, highly likely in the next year. They'd been seeking funds for about $1 million for an emergency flood alarm system, which never materialized. Meteorologists agree, though, that pinpointing hyper-local extreme rain like this, it's really challenging. But we've seen cuts to budgets that help research and staff analysis of weather events, as well as the federal agencies that help determine funding for this type of emergency service. This is the complete opposite of what we should be doing in an era of accelerating climate change disaster. It's hard to believe that I need to say this, but all people deserve access to basic emergency services that we can definitely afford to provide. And while we may not have a smoking gun that points directly to the cuts from DOGE and Trump's new budget as the cause of so much unnecessary loss of life in this particular disaster, it is a harbinger of what we can expect as climate denial is supercharged by long-term funding cuts. Small towns and rural communities who lack resources or enough political power to advocate for themselves stand to lose the most, creating de facto sacrifice zones where people are already being left behind. ICE continues to accelerate its raids across the country in the shadow of the big ugly murder bill. Everyday people also continue to fight back. Yesterday, The Atlantic published this really wild article that describes the ways that cracks are forming within the agency, and those cracks are rapidly widening. The TLDR on the article is that ICE is feeling pressure from both above in the administration and below, people in the streets. Pressure from below looks like popular resistance, both in the streets and in the media. Talking about how fucked up this is works. Showing up to do court accompaniment works. And making it hard for ICE to do their jobs works. As a result, people within the agency are increasingly disgruntled with the work that they're asked to do and the way that they're asked to do it. And they're acutely aware of how unpopular it is. In the meantime, the agency is also receiving intense scrutiny and pressure from above. Some of the terrible ghouls in the Trump administration, like Stephen Miller and Kristi Noem, are trying to impose these absurd deportation quotas on their work, meaning that morale is also down because it turns out that imposing your will through brute force isn't actually leadership. And surprise, Trump's performative social media posts aren't enough to encourage these agents who are facing public backlash and unreasonable management demands. Leadership within the agency feels unable to push back on those demands for fear of getting sacked, which has already happened several times. So it seems like a lot of the people who are responsible for this day-to-day are just frankly over it. I'm not going to shed a single tear for anyone who participates in the ghoulish work that ICE does, but it does raise some questions for me, like how does this impact the ability of the agency to rapidly hire, which is also something that we need to be worried about? How could this create defections or desertion from the agency? And what other levers can we pull? In a word, what is the opportunity in this chaos? There's certainly plenty of threats, of course. Growing ICE in the way that the murder bill does is genuinely chilling and evil. And the worry that politicizing ICE in this way means that only ideologues who are like dyed-in-the-wool extremists are going to want to sign up for doing this work. And we also know that the rapid expansion of police agencies historically has led to declining standards in hiring and training, which ultimately harm the people in those agencies' crosshairs more than they already have. I have a lot more questions than answers here, but the upshot is the cracks are showing. How can we stick our levers into the cracks and turn them into canyons? Another area we can look at opportunities and openings is the fallout from the New York mayoral primary. I'm not just talking about Zoran Mamdani as a candidate, but the effect that his upset victory is having more broadly. Here's a really interesting data point. Run for Something, which is a group that helps young first-time candidates file and run campaigns for public office at all levels, says that since the primary, over 10,000 millennials and Gen Z folks have signed up to learn how to run for office, which is fantastic. Mass participation like this is how we actually build towards governing, because one person by themselves, no matter how mediagenic, no matter how refreshing, does not a government make. Mamdani and his own campaign, it also seems, is hard at work preparing for the general election. Essential since it looks like all kinds of forces are coming out to try and sink him with smears and Islamophobia. He understands his position and is determined to play it. Finally, this all has been making me think a lot about what friend of the pod and host of our other show, the Anti-Authoritarian podcast, Scott Nakagawa, said to me a couple weeks back. That one of the great opportunities presented by the federal system in the US is that uneven, fragmented, and really hard to control system of government means that authoritarian consolidation is actually kind of hard. There are opportunities in the chaos because this country is huge, both geographically and population-wise. We can do these hard things, not just to resist, but to win. Part of the excitement around Mamdani is that everyday people are actually feeling into that. I want to take a quick moment before we dive into this interview to ask you to support Convergence during our summer fund drive. Reader and listener support is critical in a time when independent media is under, frankly, existential threat. So if this podcast has in fact helped, consider what you can give back to make sure that we can keep making it. Anyone who starts an annual or monthly subscription, gives $25 or more, or upgrades their subscription will receive a special thank you gift. Head on over to bit.ly/summerfunddrive, all one word, to make your contribution today. You'll also find that link in the show notes. Now, my guest today is writer, lawyer, and co-founder of Interrupting Criminalization, Andrea Ritchie. She's the author of Practicing New Worlds, Abolition and Emergent Strategies, Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color, among many other writings. Her work in prison and police abolition spans decades at this point, but she joins me today to discuss one of her latest publications, which is called Block and Build, but Make It Abolitionist, which is a title I love. Nice. Which explores that very concept. How do we as abolitionists strategically align ourselves in the current struggle to block the authoritarian right while building the futures that we dream of? Andrea, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. The rundown you just gave was a whole other reason we need to be having this conversation.
I know. I was like, I know that I'm going to like go deep on this ICE stuff, and like so much of the conversation about criminalization is, your analysis of criminalization, I feel like, is really essential to talking about the block work. So could you tell me a little bit about Interrupting Criminalization, the work that you do, and y'all's reasons for coming together as an organization?
Sure. So yeah, I'm just so excited to be on the podcast. I'm like a little, starstruck or something. But I co-founded Interrupting Criminalization with Mariam Kaba, who many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with.
Also
in 2018. Yes. And we came together to do this. It wasn't certainly the first time we collaborated on anything. Our paths have sort of crossed and intersected, many times over many decades. We keep trying to think back when we first met, and it keeps getting further back. But in 2018, we decided to combine forces in Interrupting Criminalization because it was during the first iteration of this regime, and both of us are very clear that criminalization is how right-wing authoritarian and fascist agendas or regimes advance their policies, advance their agendas. Actually, it's how they work. It's literally the central and instrumental kind of tool or kind of process through which fascism and authoritarianism and right-wing agendas happen. So, and we have both always worked at the intersections of criminalization, race, gender, sexuality, reproductive, gender, migrant rights, disability rights, and so on, or disability justice. And so we saw the operation of criminalization at all of those intersections in really deep ways in the first iteration of the Trump administration. And so we wanted to create a container, kind of a movement resource hub to support organizers in interrupting criminalization. We're maybe not as creative as we could have been in the title of the organization. We wanted to be clear about what we were doing.
That's what it says on the tin. Yeah.
Exactly. So want to support groups in doing that across those many intersections. And so we ended up supporting many organizers in the uprisings of 2020, groups across the country who were engaged in work to divest from the violence of policing and punishment and deportation and detention and exile, and in community-based safety strategies that were non-police, non-coercive, non-carceral, and rooted in transformative justice. And so things really took off a couple years, into our existence when we were doing that work. And then obviously it still feels very relevant in this moment, which is why we wanted to sort of respond to the framework and the brilliance that people like you and Scott and others have been putting out about kind of what the overall strategy is. Jerry Labs, Kelly Hayes, so many folks, Shane Burley, et cetera, PRA, just many entities sort of thinking about what is our strategic framework for this moment. How do we, I think, initially sort of block this regime from getting into power and build power towards an alternative that is actually an alternative, and now post, regime consolidation. What is our assignment along the lines of what you were just saying? There are cracks. It's actually not a simple thing to consolidate authoritarianism at this scale, and how do we get in there and bust it open, but not to go back to where we came from, but to go to the liberatory future that we're looking for. And speaking of liberation, I know Liberation Road and Critical Resistance also have put out frameworks. We Got Us. There's just many groups. I just want to, Rising Majority also put out a sheet that at the Portal Project Conference in the fall of 2024, that was just kind of an inspiration for us to be like, how do we take these brilliant frameworks that are based on deep research, long kind of understanding of fascism and authoritarianism, and bring in the kind of central understanding that we have around criminalization and what that means for those frameworks and expanding them.
Yeah. I love that. And I also think that the analysis around criminalization is such a useful provocation for those of us who are also thinking about, like, how do we not frame the work that we're doing right now in terms of, like, let's go back to some kind of, like, honestly, frankly, imagined past, because, like, the opportunity that we have now is actually about leading in a meaningful way from the left to, like, help people see an alternative way of being, of an alternative way that we could be together as a society. So I think that, like, that analysis around criminalization and the way that criminalization is how authoritarians do their ghoulish work is really well taken, because I think that, like, looking back at the history that you were just outlining, also just of you and Mariam working together, that, like, this is about more than just Trump and MAGA, right? That, like, criminalization has a long history in our country and has functioned in various ways at various times. So I'm wondering also to sort of set up this conversation about the contents of the zine, to talk a little bit about criminalization, who it serves, and, like, what its effects on us socially are.
Yeah, the zine definitely starts from the premise that criminalization is at the center of how fascism, authoritarianism, but also colonialism, chattel slavery, and imperialism, including its most extreme forms, for instance, in the manifestation of the genocide that is happening in this moment as babies are dying from lack of formula due to forced starvation in concentration camps in Gaza right now as we are talking. That is criminalization at its most extreme form, right? Where we decide an entire nation of people on a particular area of land are, from newborn to nonagenarian, inherently criminalized, and therefore an inherent threat to a desired social order, and therefore destined for extermination, which of course Palestinian people and their allies have been resisting with all of their might and being and breath for 75 years and long before that. So it's not a predetermined result, but it is the desired result. So I just wanted to name that, because it's important to understand criminalization as a political process. I think sometimes we think of criminalization as just, the enactment of laws that say certain things are crimes, and then we might have some quibbling with how they're enforced. It might be discriminatory, it might be excessive, we might think some things shouldn't be crimes, like smoking weed or crossing the street outside a crosswalk, or people have different views about what should and shouldn't be criminalized, but people tend to think of it as this sort of impartial process of enforcing some laws that are based on sort of norms we all share. And what we want to point out is, one, that's not it. It's never an objective thing that is enforced, maybe unequally. It's literally a political process that is designed to designate certain groups of people as inherently threats to a social order, whose every action is criminalized, including just sometimes standing on a corner. It's called loitering, right. or breathing, as a newborn might be trying to do in Gaza right now. And the idea is to then, once we frame them as an existential threat to an existing or past or future social order, and I really want to pick up on what you're saying, is like, we're actually in a duel of imaginaries right now, right? Like, it's their imaginary about some sort of idyllic past of the United States, which is basically chattel slavery and colonialism and genocide, and our imaginary, hopefully, of a future that is beyond what we are experiencing or ever have experienced. But we need to be careful not to also be falling back into an imaginary of some past that was never idyllic in this country for Black people, Indigenous people, disabled people, migrants, everyone who's trans, gender nonconforming people, etc. So this criminalization process is part of that imaginary construction, right? And it is about saying that we could have something imagined, or if these people didn't exist, if this threat didn't exist, and therefore we create categories of people who are the them, right? There's us and them. They are the threat. They are the outsiders. They are unworthy of public benefits, sharing in public wealth, of being in public spaces, of being part of our society. They are a threat. They are a cancer. They are an invasion of our society, and are a danger to our society and to the most vulnerable people in our society. And therefore, they must be, under kind of normal circumstances, surveilled, policed, contained, controlled, imprisoned, deported, and that sort of regular level of criminalization normalizes a kind of violence against criminalized people. Once we criminalize someone, it's okay to separate them from their family. It's okay to put them in a cell that is smaller than, most of the rooms we're sitting in right now, for decades. It's okay to put them in solitary without human touch or contact for decades. It's okay to deny them books and hugs with their family. It's okay to deny them food, medical care, and it's okay to deny them the right to be in a place they might have grown up their whole life, or be part of a community in a particular way. And that's just normalized. People understand that to be what we do with people once they're criminalized. And we also normalize that some people will be and some people won't. And I often give the example to law students, that they'll be like, well, but everybody agrees murder is bad, right? Like, killing someone is bad. I'm like, but do we? When, Obama sends a drone to Yemen and kills somebody, nobody even bats an eyelid. They're like, that's great. It's an act of national, security. When a cop kills someone, it's always somehow justified in self-defense. Yet when a survivor of violence that goes on over decades, who has been told by their abuser that the next time they're definitely going to kill them, defends themselves, somehow that is the murder, right? And everything else I just described is just normal. And so I just really want to emphasize that, because I think people are starting to kind of exceptionalize the violence that they're seeing now. I was on a talk the other day, and I was talking about exactly what I'm talking about now, like criminalization. This country was founded on criminalization. Criminalization is what made colonization possible. It's what made chattel slavery possible. It's the how of those things. It's how they're continuing today in kind of aftermaths or continued form. And they kept being like, in the chat, they were like, talk about ICE. Why aren't you talking about ICE? You have to talk about ICE. And I was like, I literally am talking about ICE.
Yeah, you're doing it right now.
I don't understand why this is not clicking, but I think that people are exceptionalizing the violence of ICE and not understanding that it is the regular violence of ICE that they just haven't seen, because they haven't seen this volume and they haven't been doing it this visibly at such a scale, right? Yeah. And they've been doing it this visibly, just to be clear, but at this scale. Yeah. And so I think the first part of the project of this zine and for interrupting criminalization this moment is to help people understand that criminalization has always been this political process. It has always been something that isn't just about unfair enforcement of laws, but literally what we understand and who we understand to be, quote unquote, crimes and criminals, that is just embedded in our society from 1492 and whenever they set sail in this direction, right? Or set sail towards the direction where my ancestors were. That is a process that's been ongoing, and then it just builds over time and shifts depending on the political winds. Yeah. So I think we often think of authoritarianism and criminalization as it's how they repress their enemies. It's how they go after dissidents. It's how they punish dissent. But that's not the only way. And it's not just that they then can use the existing criminal legal system and criminal punishment system to use it as a tool of their nefarious deeds. It's also this sort of more global process that doesn't just operate through criminal laws. It also operates through civil laws. The DOJ just served a bunch of civil subpoenas on trans healthcare providers that were about, claiming that providing trans healthcare basically is fraud, is the sort of basic theory of what they're saying. It's more complicated than that, but that's a civil claim. And they're also going to use, regulatory bodies, and people use policies at the library to criminalize people. They use policies at the hospital to criminalize people. There's many ways in which criminalization happens through many laws, regulations, policies, through every institution in society. And frankly, we all participate in it and engage in it.
Because it's cultural. And I think that's an interesting intervention that like the zine offers, is like, this is part of our culture, and like we're steeped in it in a lot of ways.
It's literally embedded in how we think of the world, and I think that's part of what we need to block and break. As part of this project of resisting fascism and authoritarianism, is we have to uproot the parts of it that enable it inside of us, and we have to recognize that criminalization is how. It's not just how they do it; it's how they manufacture consent for what they're doing. Right? Because a certain level of violence has been normalized for criminalized people, they just keep naming more and more people as criminalized and heightening the way in which they're named as criminalized. And then somehow people are like, oh, well, they're just going after those people. Or, well, that is kind of what we do to those people. Maybe not this harshly, but it is what we do to those people. And we really suddenly find ourselves in a place where we are now. People are like, wait, how is this happening? It's like, well, we've been going along with this for some time now. You've been okay with this for some time now, or at least, for some people under some circumstances. And this is the full-blown edition of it. Now we have to contend with that, but we also have to contend with what made it possible and what continues to make it possible. And that is, I think, the challenge.
Yeah. And that's a challenge that is about political power, but it's also understanding this like larger picture of what, like, it strikes me that in what you're describing, criminalization is almost like a theory of governance, right? It's like a theory of how we run a society in terms of like who makes decisions about what, who is subject to what, and also that is like, yeah, about how we live that out in our daily lives. And like one of the things that I'm really struck by as you're talking is like I've been thinking a lot about the way that the surveillance apparatus that is being sort of like leveraged against movements right now is something that really like started taking shape in the aftermath of 9/11, right? That it was like Bush era stuff, but then that was continued by the Obama administration, and that like kind of has been part of this bipartisan consensus that is about fundamentally about criminalization, that like that is actually what both the Democratic and Republican parties agree on some level, is like that criminalization is of like certain kinds of people is like core to our like culture and our politics. And I find that to be like, I don't know, I've been sitting a lot with this, and I've been thinking a lot about like really the early 2000s, like when I was, a teenager and I was politicized, that like so much of the stuff that we're seeing Trump be able to mobilize against communities and against movements comes directly out of that time, and that like it's just a straight line. It's a straight line between
it is.
And I think that like there's a lot of ways in which the discourse around the war on terror created the opening for, as you say, the manufacturing of consent around mass surveillance and really like a massive rollback in rights that I feel like in the early 2000s, people were like, ooh, like this is actually a problem, but it wasn't taken seriously because we really were fully like we're exporting democracy pilled or something, which is,
and I'm so sorry to say that it just goes back so much further than that. I'm just like, 2000s when you were in high school.
Totally.
Obviously I came up in the Reagan era, although I wasn't in the United States that whole time, but that's the whole criminalization, demonization of low-income Black women is a process of criminalization that sure did involve criminal law at some point, but also just involved a lot of administrative law, a lot of denial of benefits, a lot of conditioning of benefits in ways that were profoundly eugenic, and patriarchal, and so Reagan certainly did a lot of that, but who continued the project, right? Biden, the author of the Violent Crime Act of 1994, Clinton, the author of 10 bills, including the sort of baseline for the immigration regime that is now being enforced, right? And so I think that is part of why there's so many reasons why the opposition that needs to be is not. But I do think this is a huge part of it, is that the Democrats are deeply invested in criminalization and don't want to be seen as not as invested in it as anybody else. In fact, sometimes try and show they're more invested in it than authoritarians. And so it really is literally what's impeding an actual resistance, right? And I wish I could just demonize the Democrats for that, but it is also, I think, more than, I would say, more than cowardice, more than just belief that if I just keep my head down, maybe somehow this will blow over like a tropical summer storm, is actually that people are caught up in the logic of criminalization in a way that then has us policing our resistance, policing who we show up for, forcing people to prove their value and their absence of threat to society, like hardworking farm workers. What about your lettuce? You're not going to get your lettuce if they don't stop rounding people up. Like, who's going to take care of your children? Like that kind of logic is still a criminalizing logic, right? And it's all built around this notion of an ideal citizen, which is a profoundly eugenic notion, a profoundly ableist notion, clearly deeply racist, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-migrant, and certainly transphobic, homophobic, deeply patriarchal. But we're building this idealized citizen, and then everyone who falls outside of that is criminalized. And that certainly means laws, whether it's a cross-dressing law, what they used to call ugly laws that were basically about not having disabled people in public spaces, or, you know, the ways in which all the ways people are policed. But also, we're not going to give you benefits. And so criminalization is also what was behind what you just appropriately called the MAGA murder bill, because it was literally saying people who are not ideal citizens, who are somehow lazy, who are somehow taking advantage of the system, who are somehow, you know, certainly migrants, but also trans people and also pregnant people and also disabled people, are not entitled to share in our common good, in our common wealth. And so we're going to cut them off, and we're going to justify it with all those criminalizing narratives and stories, and feed into your idea that people who you know, are fraudulent in some way deserve to be punished by being denied fruits and vegetables. I just, you know, or healthcare. And I think that's, again, I keep saying that it's criminalization is how we got here. It's how we're staying here, and it's not how we're going to get out of here. And that actually really matters a lot. And it's only by uprooting criminalization that we have the best chance of fighting and defeating authoritarianism and fascism in this country. And so to the extent that we are reproducing criminalizing narratives in our resistance, we're actually going against our own interests. We are fueling the project that we're supposedly trying to fight. So that's a huge part of why we put this out, and of the work that we do at IC, is to help people understand their own complicity and their own addiction to policing and punishment, and really unlearn that. And that doesn't mean that we don't have accountability. That doesn't mean we don't have mutual responsibility and reciprocity and standards that we live by as a community that reflect our values, and practices that reflect our values, and that we don't have a social contract that we co-create and that we co-manage together. I just want to be super clear about that. But we have to be moving towards the future and the present from that place, not like who should be punished instead, or who should be punished harder, or which person it's okay to send to a gulag and which person we absolutely can't tolerate it. And, you know, which person has proven their value such that I shouldn't be chasing them through the fields, and I should be chasing no one anywhere. Right. But, and then who, you know, maybe, you know, they did do these things. So maybe not that hard, but don't go that hard on them, but something should be done. Right. And I think, we're seeing even, I'll just say it, the Center for American Progress just put out some supposedly oppositional platform around migration that just reiterates exactly every single criminalizing narrative, and basically is continuing to build the foundation for what's happening now, while just saying like, but maybe not like exactly like this. So many advanced cases. You're just it's
look,
day, I guess.
This is why we podcast, to get it out. Well, and I think that one of the things that the zine is really useful for is kind of guiding people through doing their own analysis of this kind of thing, which I think is like, you know, in this time where it just feels like there's this onslaught of things that we feel like we need to respond to. I think that like one of the interventions that you all are making here that I find really valuable is like, we do need more tools to help people slow down and think through the like internal logic of what they're responding to, in large part because so much of this stuff is so deeply ingrained in everything we've learned about what it means to be a participant in society, right? That like there's some really it feels contradictory to slow down and think carefully about this stuff, but like the thing that I do think we need more of are more accessible tools like this that help people do that for themselves, because like people need to feel into it and like fully understand what that means for them. And I think that's like one of the like gifts of this particular strategic framework, is that it's like, actually think about it. What does this mean for you in your life? Where do you see it? Which is also like not something that, you know, I think that it doesn't feel like we have time for it, but it's also like it's an investment we do need to make now.
1,000%. And I think it does feel like we don't have time for it, but what we need are spaces of like collective sense making. We need as many places like this where you and I are talking, and in the talking with each other, understand more of the bigger picture of what's happening. Because otherwise, yes, it's just a million assaults a minute. Oh, they just did this. Oh, but they just did this. Oh, but they just did that. And our brains can't process it. And we shut down and we're like, I hope it's not there tomorrow. But it turns out it's going to be there tomorrow.
Yeah, it's going to be there.
Right. Right. And so we did want to create a tool. We literally kind of made it for your listeners, right? And people who are thinking about what do we do now? And it really is designed as a tool to like be in a conversation with yourself, and then with your group, and then with your local Indivisible chapter, and your local Working Family Parties chapter, or your local No Kings people, or your local 5150. No, that's a Van Halen song. With the 5051.
Yeah.
Yes, that one. Sorry. But see, again, telling on myself about my generation. It's really, let's think through, how do we take this moment to get to a different other side, right? I don't want to go back to the world there's going to be a lot of suffering. There's already a lot of suffering just in the last 6 months, a tremendous amount of suffering, and way more, kind of ahead of us in the best of circumstances. So what we wanted was to give people a moment to be like, okay, what could we be doing as part of this fight that isn't just fighting to get back to the same thing, right? Because I don't want to go back to the same thing. I don't want us to go through all that suffering to go back to the same thing. I don't want to go through all of the people who are dying for lack of abortion care, who are being forced birth, sometimes completely unconscious for lack of abortion care. I don't want us to suffer in that way and then go back to Roe, which had some of the same outcomes because of course, there's going to be someone picking up garbage outside my window at this moment. So I'm just going to try and talk over them. But I don't want to go back to that. I want to go towards a liberatory future. And so this is an invitation to be in a conversation what that is. So it's one for folks who are already engaged in work that is about interrupting and challenging criminalization. It's for them to like listen to your podcast and be like, oh, that's a really important framework, but where does my work fit in that? It'd be like, your work is at the center of it, homie. It's right there. It's like, it's work, right? You are in the best position to do the things that we need to do right now because you've been doing them and you know kind of how to do it. It's also an invitation to people who haven't been doing interrupting criminalization work to kind of expand their understanding of what's possible. So yes, absolutely, we call our senators and we yell at them and we tell them, to do the right thing, to block the bill, to do this or that. And also, we need to expand our vision of what's possible, and be clear about what we could be doing that will interrupt the criminalization that's making everything in the bill possible, or that's manufacturing consent for it. And then it's also an invitation to kind of really find your lane. To really think about what is the thing that you and your group have the most power and influence to do and do best. Some of us are just a block. Like, I'm just always a block. I'm just like, we're going to stop whatever. And it's like, I'm a Capricorn. I'm on every personality kind of test, it comes out the same. I'm the block. So then what do I need to block? Right. And in order to stop the train, throw sand in the gears, slow the roll of it, and make room for other people to build the next thing. And obviously we got to be in conversation doing that together. But it's also to really think through, like, where do you have power? Because I think this moment people are just like, we lost everything. We were out organized, shrug emoji. No, no, like, you have power. You have the power of who you can be in like who in your life listens to you. I mean, in my case, beyond my cat, right? But there are people that you have power and influence with. They could be your family. They could be your friend group. They could be your church group. They could be your quilting group. They could be your Comic-Con friends. Like, it doesn't matter. Who can you be in conversation with about these things? And then how do you expand that group? And I think there's a lot of sort of thinking through in the tool. There's this graphic that Scott Nakagawa made about power under authoritarian rule, which looks very daunting and overwhelming. But it also reminds you that, like, this person at the top or this class at the top can't do everything without all of these people. And those of us at the bottom here in the green, it's a very thin line, but we can pick these people off and bring them to our line, right? And undermine the consent for all of this. And then we have a graphic in here from Makani Themba about all the ways that we can do that. There's many ways that we can hold power. Informationally, with an organized base, with our refusal, with our spiritual power, our faith power, you know, our there's many ways, economic power, cultural power, etc. So we have to figure out where we have the power to do these strategies: block, break, blunt, make it, you know, okay, well, we have this, the Medicare and Medicaid are going to be impacted in a particular way. How do we lessen the impact of that on our communities by advocacy at the state and local level, and then also by building communities of care for folks? Where do we need to build bridges? We're not all going to agree. There are people I need to build with to get out of this that I don't agree with. There's no question about it. And we're going to talk about criminalization, and we're going to talk about criminalization, and then we're going to talk about criminalization. Like, it's going to be, you know, I have beloved family who are like really angry about what's going on and in the lock 'em up department. And I'm like, okay, but can we talk about, you know, and we'll just keep talking about it. Right. And the tool is really an invitation to think about criminalization at the center. What does that expand in terms of our field of vision about where we need to be fighting and what's possible? And then which of the strategies are we best suited to, best positioned to engage in, and where do we have the most power to engage it? And then go, but recognize that we're doing that as part of a quilt, as part of a tapestry, and that we are doing that as part of a broader anti-authoritarian movement that is also moving these strategies in different ways. So go ahead, build power for Zoran Mamdani. Like, that's what some people are doing, and we're going to build the thing that we're then going to push him to implement, that is a non-police, non-carceral crisis response that really is non-police, non-carceral, right? Like, we build power in many ways in that way, as long as we're doing it in coordination and concert with each other, and in ways that aren't impeding and undermining each other. And that is the real kind of trick and dance of this moment. But that, again, is the invitation of this tool, is to really think about how to do that.
Yeah.
But it really is intended to be something you sit down with yourself and think through, with your group, with, you know, maybe there's like a podcast listener group, or like folks who listen to this podcast together, you know, do it together, think through it together, and then find your crew and move in concert and collaboration.
Yeah, I also think this insight about like being able to pick a lane, commit to it, do it well, is like advice well taken, right? That like part of what is I don't know, speaking of the people who I have influence with, like I play Magic the Gathering on a regular basis with the same group of people. And we were just talking last night about how deeply immobilizing the way that the Trump administration is being covered is for people who are like, I'm the only person whose full-time job is movement facing. Everybody else is like software engineers and social workers. And, you know, they're people who make things happen in the economy, right? Like, and you know, the consensus in the room is very much like, it's hard to pay attention to anything when it feels like this. And that like so much of, I think, what is hard when you're not in a political organization, whether that's like at the neighborhood level or otherwise, is to like know where to point yourself. And that like just that can be immensely illuminating. And the other thing that strikes me is like, you do spend several pages also talking about contradictions, which I think like,
oh yeah,
we love talking about contradictions here at Convergence. It's a thing. But like, I think that, you know, the stuff that you're also describing about being in this broader project of dismantling fascism in this moment means that like we do have to work with people who we don't agree with, and we do have to interact with systems that are like raise some questions for us, right? That like our ability, our comfort, our tolerance for those contradictions. Actually, I do think there's a muscle that needs to be built there for a lot of our folks who are like committed to the movement, who share liberatory visions for the future, that like we need to get real comfy with contradictions real fast, because the contradictions are manifold.
Yeah. And we have to figure out how to move through them in ways that are generative and not destructive. And but I will say about your magic crew, like that's why I'm wearing the "Let This Radicalize You" T-shirt, and sometimes I have to wear it for myself. Look at the name. And you know, because I think this moment can be demobilizing or radicalizing, right? And our job as organizers is to make it radicalizing, right? Our job as organizers is to say, take the conversation that's happening over the coffee clutch or the, you know, community garden about, whoa, shit is terrible, like, and be like, correct. Now let's think of the most, you know, radical understanding of that, meaning at the root of the problem, and let's rip at that root, like in the community garden or at the, how can we do that as a group? But yes, you're going to run into contradictions, or people are going to be like, absolutely, electoral power is the only way to go. We can't do anything without electoral power. Someone else will be like, we have to build power to stop climate collapse, or all of this is irrelevant. Someone will say, points made. You know, because criminalization is a response in part to, you know, climate collapse and the ever dwindling sort of livable areas of land and resources. And there's definitely the agenda is to police the borders around those more violently, more heavily, criminalize more people outside of them. And, you know, genocide is the plan. And as someone pointed out at the conference you and I were both just at, they're just normalizing that now, so that when it's happening, as climate collapse proceeds, it'll just be what we do. And then the goal will just not to be on one side of that equation, it will be to be on the other, right? And so we have to radically shift or be like, I'm not accepting that future. I refuse that future. I refuse that future. Most people we're in conversation with refuse that future. How do we pull them from there into our project? And it will require listening to somebody who's like, lock them all up, and not be like, be like, sure, but would locking that one person up stop these other people from doing what they're doing? Because it's not just a one-person project. And would it stop the social forces that led to this person having the power they have? And could we think about that? And, you know, yes, if you really want to build power in that way, go forth. But, you know, remember that it requires a whole, you know, spectrum of things. I think another contradiction, like, so how do we think about building power? But we have to be building it, right? That's the key. We can't just talk about it. We actually have to be doing it. And then, you know, if people don't want to do it one way, then they should definitely be doing it another way. Like, they can't just be complaining about it. And then another contradiction, you know, is, you know, as a lawyer, kind of my favorite is the one about the rule of law. Like, we have abandoned the rule of law. We need to return to the rule of law. We're a lawless country, etc. Like, yes, we have been, right? Like, the rule of law, as I learned in law school, is what people in power say it is. Right. And don't think this is just coming from me. The Supreme Court has literally written that down. It has literally said the conquered will never find justice in the courts of the conqueror, period. You know, and that case is still good law. So they're really clear about, and certainly the Supreme Court is demonstrating that now in very clear terms, right? The rule of law is whatever people say in power say it is. And that's what our analysis of criminalization also leads us to. So to say we want to return to a rule of law means we want to return to the degular level of criminalization. We want to return to a kind of, you know, just right level of policing, and a just right level of incarceration, and a just right level of kidnapping off the streets of certain people, right? And a just right level of control of trans people. And that's the part that we need to really understand, that like the rule of law is the carceral state. The rule of law is what we're fighting. Because the rule of law was never going to punish people in power. And it operates the same at every level, whether you're going to a summons court in New York City, where every Black person is being asked how long they need to pay the fine, which presumes that they've already been adjudicated guilty, as they're walking up to the bench before they've even opened their mouth to plead guilty or not guilty. And every white person who's walking up before they even get there to plead guilty or not guilty is being adjourned in contemplation of dismissal. Like, I've watched it so many days, right? But that doesn't just happen in New York City summons court about, like, you know, drinking in public tickets. That happens at every level. Criminalization operates the same as every level. So people who are deeply invested in the International Criminal Court could see the racial makeup of how that court operates also, right? And whose flagrant gross violence is never going to be addressed through there, despite some people's, you know, best efforts, because it's how the system is structured. And it's from summons court to ICC, criminalization works the same. And so we have to really figure out how to understand what we really want is a new social contract. And we want people to find ways of adhering to a social contract. So I don't want to go back to the rule of law, which often also did not actually prevent the harms that we say. So for instance, anti-discrimination law didn't stop discrimination, right? It gave people a recourse, but it didn't stop it. And certainly, you know, quote unquote, hate crimes laws did not stop homophobic, transphobic, racial, gender violence, anti-migrant violence. In fact, they were often used against those same groups. And so, but what I do want, that doesn't mean I don't want anything. I want an agreement in our community that we don't discriminate against trans people. I want a pact in our community that we are a warm and welcoming space for everyone, and we make sure that everyone gets the care they need, the affirmation they need, is addressed respectfully, whether you changed your name because you got married, whether you changed your name because you didn't like the name your parents gave you, whether you changed your name because it's reflective of who you are from a gender perspective or any other, right? Like, we welcome everyone. You know, we will address you as you want to be addressed because everyone deserves that. And whether, you know, you're, no matter what. And that's where I think we need to lean, instead of having debates about whether the rule of law is what we want or not. Like, how do we want to live our values in practice? And how do we want to make agreements around that and hold each other in accountability around that in ways that aren't about policing and punishment, but also aren't about we all do whatever. And, you know, whoever has the most power now kind of wins in that situation too, right? So
yeah, there's also a thing about this imagination piece that is the thing that I am also often finding myself talking about with people, is just that, like, going back to the rule of law means that we're constantly going to be fighting these, like, rear guard defensive fights, that, like, the opportunity that this moment presents is, like, if people are more ready right now, I think, to hear this kind of conversation than they've ever been, certainly in my lifetime. You know, that, like, there's an opportunity to ask questions about why we make decisions the way we make decisions, about whom and to what ends. Because I think that even if it's not like a fully articulated politics of, we know that, like, Trump and MAGA didn't come from nowhere, that, like, when we see a shift in this extreme way towards authoritarianism, we do have, like, responsible humans should probably ask the question, how in the hell did we get here? Right? And, like, being able to hold space for that conversation and that learning, and just, like, the really this uncomfortable process of self-discovery, I feel like is it's crucial. And I think that, like, in a lot of ways, this zine gives people permission to do that, right? That, like, there's so much about, like, I don't know, what is normalized in society, that, like, we actually just need somebody else to be like, hey, it's cool to slow down. It's cool to do less. It's cool to think about these questions that maybe, like, have been, like, itching you in the back of your brain, but then let's surface them. Let's actually process it. That I feel like is a deeply necessary intervention to keep us from doing that defensive rearguard thing, where it's like, yeah, I don't, you know, a lot of people are really worried about the, like, ratchet effect of, like, there's this back and forth swing, right, where there's these one-term presidents, but then, like, the far right is able to consolidate power and actually pull. This is, like, one of my one of my rants that I'm constantly ranting about is like there's a process of polarization that's happening, and it is polarization that is explicitly from the right, and it's driven by the like think tank research media machine that manufactures consent for right-wing policies, that then is like normalized by sort of like a frankly mostly just feckless Democratic Party that like is unwilling to acknowledge that that's what's happening. That like polarization is not the process of, ooh, the left is so extreme, the right is so extreme. Polarization is the process of our society becoming competing. Yeah, and it's like that. The rhetoric of polarization assumes that we're all fighting on the same terrain, and it's like we're simply not. The far right has invested tens of billions of dollars into this for 75 years or whatever plus.
But let me just say also that they understand power, including the power of relationships. And I think that's the thing is I think sometimes, and something I write a little bit about in Practicing New Worlds is we're really like looking at the tip of the iceberg. We're looking at the judiciary. We're looking at the elected officials. We're looking at the presidency. We're looking at the product and the media, ecosystem and the culture and all that. But we're looking at the product of something that was unseen for a long time.
Right.
While we were doing digital organizing and mass mobilization, they were talking to their neighbors. They were babysitting their kids. They were holding church potlucks. They were going and praying with people when they lost someone. They were helping someone rebuild their house after a flood. They were doing all kinds of things that cemented those relationships in which people then make sense of the world and decide to take action based on the sense that they've made of the world together, right? And of course, there's more wind in their sails because their way they make sense of the world is about coming after the usual suspects and targets, and also about individualizing the problem, scapegoating individuals as opposed to looking at the system. Meanwhile, on our side, we're like, look at the big system that you feel powerless to actually address. And we're not really good at being like, this is who you should be mad at. I think, Tesla takedown is a really good example, right? People are like, oh, this is who you should be mad at. And people are mad. And they're being very effective in targeting their madness, right? And we need to, mad meaning rage. And we need to sort of be similar, right? With, we need to be better at directing that. But they did that through these one-on-one conversations and relationships, one revival, one, again, barn raising, one, I come harvest your crop, you come harvest mine, conversation at a time. And that's the part that we need to be clear about. And so I believe that we need to be looking at all parts of the iceberg. And again, this is like, and then how do we chip away at it, right? What do we need to chip away at inside ourselves, in each other, in the way that we understand society, and then in terms of their power, and how do we want to do it?
Yeah. It's big game, but I also feel like, one of the things that I was so excited to talk to you about today is just simply how like a lot of the like trailhead for this is asking these questions, talking amongst ourselves, really like being thoughtful, right? And like having something like this zine out there that like helps people do that work on their own, that like is like a self-guided tour to like developing your power analysis in your community and in your place is desperately needed, I think. And like people are constantly asking us at Convergence for more sort of like political education tools. So it's like, it brings me great joy to like see so many people who are thinking so rigorously about this stuff making really important contributions to this conversation. So I really appreciate it.
Yourself included. And I just, again, want to emphasize to your listeners, like, we wrote this for you. Please give it a look. And, there's also tensions about how do we, again, work with folks who might not only agree with us, but kind of blame us for this moment, right?
Yeah.
Because, reformists are like, you abolitionists went too far, and now look what we're doing with it. I'm like, you didn't let us go far enough, and now look what we're doing it, right? And I know I'm right, but I don't need to. At this point, I can just be like, let's that debate serves them. Like we can, let's talk about what right now we need to be doing together to address the problem we both see as critical in this moment. And in the doing of it, we're going to talk about, trust me, we're going to talk about that thing that you just said, but we're not going to talk about it as an entry point for us to be able to go shoulder to shoulder against the thing we both fight. And and we're going to talk about, you know, whatever bullshit someone just said about, you know, trans people tried to go too far. I'm going to say, I don't agree with you up front. I'm not hiding that. But I'm going to say, let's agree that everyone should be allowed to be called by the name and be the person they want and have private conversations with their healthcare providers about their healthcare without you getting involved in my private conversation about my healthcare, just like you wouldn't want me involved in your private conversation about your healthcare. And let's start there, and then we'll come back to that other thing you said. I promise you, I'm not letting it go. But it's, again, not the precondition for me to go out and fight with you against something that is going to need all of us to fight. And so that's how we block and build together, and hopefully get to the other side. That is a liberated future, not a return to the kind of low-grade fever of this massive infection.
Yeah, I think that is quite right. Thank you so much, Andrea. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so grateful to you for letting me rant and hearing yours too.
Deeply here for it.
Thanks.
My thanks again to Andrea Ritchie for joining us today. You can find a printable and digital version of Block and Build, but Make It Abolitionist at interruptingcriminalization.com. We will put a direct link to that in the show notes so it's easy to find. This show is published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Caden Mock. Our producer is Josh Elstro. Kimmy David designed our cover art, and Logan Gross is our intern. If you have something to say, please do drop me a line. You can send me an email that we'll consider running on an upcoming mailbag episode at mailbag@convergencemag.com. And finally, of course, if you would like to support the work that we do at Convergence, bringing our movements together to strategize, struggle, and win in this crucial historical moment, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/donate. Even a few bucks a month goes a really long way to helping our independent small team continue to build a map for our movements. I hope this helps.